So I'm working on this project where I'm patching cracks in drywall, and it seems that the original tape job has just not held. It just was not done very well. So a lot of cracks have come over the years, and what I'm doing is fixing them. And I got the brilliant idea that maybe I'd share my methods with those of you that have never done this before. See how this is buckled here? And you can hear how it's a little hollow behind there. That's the sheetrock tape that has lifted. Over here, see that? That's all buckled and lifted. And I've already gone down here and started prepping these cracks. So I'll show you my methods for how I go about fixing this. The first thing I do is take a putty knife and just get under and tear away, the loose material. And in this case, that's also the original seam tape. And all that's loose, this wall is just all damaged. So I need to get rid of all that. So the first thing here then is just getting that away, and then I'm making sure I've got 2 inches over top of this seam because that's the width of the drywall tape. I'm using a paint scraper and I'm just feathering down the edges. I want them sort of tapered in all around here. I'm scraping the mud and the textured surface down. That will make it easier when I put the new coat of mud to get a smooth application. Okay, see, I've scraped this all down, nice tapered edge. That'll make it so I can feather out the mud really well. And I noticed in doing this, I don't see any screws or nails on the seam. Listen, hear that? It's hollow behind there, which means they didn't seam the sheetrock on a stud. Yeah, look at that. Totally hollow. That's a really crappy drywall installation. It was improperly cut. They left this big gap. There's a big gap in here, and there's not even a stud behind there. There's no nails or screws to secure this. So it's going to flex or vibrate and crack on the seam. It's discouraging to run into such terrible craftsmanship. I'm not in a position where I can tear this out right now and redo this whole thing. So I'm going to go ahead and just patch this seam, though it'll probably crack again down the road. I cut a little piece of insulating foam to stuff in this crack to act as a little bit of a backer. And I've cut sheetrock tape to fit over this joint here, and a little piece to go over top of that crack there. Just like that. And notice how I actually tapered the corner up here so it fits into my raw plaster work. I'm just going to apply joint compound over that seam. I have to leave it kind of thick because it's pretty irregular, and we want to fill any voids. And fill up this crack at the bottom here, like that. And I'll just adhere the seam tape right over top of the joint compound. That looks about right. And you use a putty knife to press it in. Make sure it's fully in contact. And I'll just apply joint compound over the top. Now at this point I don't want to make it too thick because there's quite a layer underneath. It needs to dry, and it'll just take too long to dry if I make this too thick. Now I'm using all-purpose joint compound. You want to be sure to use that. You don't want to use topping. They sell a smooth topping mix, and you don't want to use that. That doesn't provide the adhering properties you need. All right. That should be it. That's got to dry, and then I'll come back, tomorrow and do a top coat and get that feathered out. So this is dry. Let's see, can I reach over my head? There we go. And I'm ready to do my smooth coat. So this is how I go about it. The first thing I need to do is I just take a putty knife and I just sort of run it over and take off all the, the little ridges, just gently. I just don't want any bumps or ridges that are gonna, catch the putty knife as I trowel the next smooth coat on here. I'm using a wide, a 10-inch mud knife. I load it with mud, and the first thing is just to get it onto the seam. Then I clean off the knife and give it one pass, and I take off a lot of the extra mud. How much I'm taking off. And that's not bad right there. A little ridge out here. Take that off. And let's see. If we overwork it, it just gets worse. I'm just taking a little off at that point. A little bit there. And that's okay. Right there, there's a little ridge I see, there's a little hole there. But you know what? This is good enough for the first pass. I'll have to do this one more time, and then I'll smooth this whole thing out before I do my texture coat. This is dried, so I'm going to do that same process one more time. Just run the putty knife over it, take off any little bumps and ridges. Then I load my 10-inch trowel. Put a pretty heavy coat over the seam. Yeah, a little more than that, maybe over here. Get some on there. Clean off the trowel, and then I just take off the extra. One pass. That's pretty good. I just made a ridge there. I'll take that off. Yeah. That's good. I like it. Now that it's once again dry, I can do the final smoothing. This is what the edge of my patch looks like now. It's a little bit sharp, and I need to feather it out to really make it disappear. There are a few imperfections in the mud out through the center down here on this edge, but it's not bad, and I'll be able to make all that disappear also. I hung a piece of white paper by my skylight to reflect some light over here, make it a little easier to see what I'm doing. Once again, I use my putty knife and I just knock off any sharp little ridges that might be standing up. Using a terry cloth rag and a bucket with some water, I wet the rag, wring it out really well, and then I gently rub in over that seam, the edge of the mud, just to feather it down. The mud dissolves with water and the rag picks up the little bit of extra material and it just takes off the ridge that's there. When working on small patches and a wall that already has texture, this really works a lot better than sanding. And it's also a lot cleaner. You don't get dust everywhere. Once I've feathered the edge, then I kind of cross over the entire surface. And that just removes any central ridges or ribs, and it makes them disappear. This is what the edge looks like now that I've feathered it out with a damp rag. No sharp ridge. And the patch is really smooth. There might be a few small imperfections, but they will completely disappear once I do the texture coat. This is dry, it's nice and smooth, it's time to texture. Now admittedly, this is the trickiest part of patching drywall, matching an existing texture. This texture is a very fine skip trowel. It's a vintage like 1970s type of texture. So this is how I'm going to match it. I use a stiff nylon brush, something with a good handle I can get a grip on for applying the joint compound, and my 10-inch mud knife. For this to work best, I need to thin the joint compound just slightly. I've added maybe about a tablespoon of water to approximately 2 cups of joint compound. See how it almost starts to run a little bit, not quite? That's about right to do this texturing. I use my stiff brush and I load it with some joint compound, but we don't want to overload it. That's a little too much. I got to shake it off. Now this is a little bit of a messy process, but fortunately this is all water soluble. It's easy to clean up, but it's going to splatter around a little bit. So that looks about right. Then I simply tap it against the wall on the patched area, and I go a little bit beyond. And it's simply sort of scattering the compound around the surface. We don't want to have it too thick, too heavy, because this is a fine texture. I just keep adding a little bit to the brush and tap it against the wall. Okay, that looks pretty good. So this is what it looks like up close. You can kind of see how it's splattered around, but it's not fully covered, right? We don't want a dense covering. Then I use my 10-inch knife and I draw it over the surface. And notice how I keep it very flat against the wall as I do it, because I'm not trying to take the compound off, I'm just trying to flatten down the top. Any compound that comes onto the knife, I take it off. And then I do that again. And I go multiple directions. Some of the compound sort of rolls up, it peels up on the wall as I do this. It looks a little rough, but that's okay. We're just going to leave that once we kind of get it knocked down the way we like it. All right, I like that. Now this is what it looks like after I've done the knockdown with the trowel. My texture coat is dry on all my patchwork up here and back there and over there, but I've got one more step to do before I can prime and paint it. See how the new texture is pretty crisp and defined because of these hard edges. The old surface has been painted so many times that the texture's been softened by being filled with paint and there's no sharp edges. So in order for this new patch to blend better, I need to knock off the crisp edges. What I do to soften the edges is just like before, I run the putty knife over it sort of gently just to take off any hard pieces sticking out, any little lumps. Then I take a dry terry cloth rag and I give it a gentle rub. Ooh, see the dust coming off there? That's taking the crispness out of the edges of that. Check this out now. See, it's still new, fresh, a little bold, but all these edges are rounded a little bit. And now when I paint it, it's going to be a much better blend to the old surface out here. After being painted, this is what the finished repair looks like.